Men are aggressive and use violence as a form of perpetuating their power. Women use violence in order to escape it. And I think that really needs to be held on to. It's a very different response to violence.
Hi everyone, and welcome to In Solidarity, the Open Democracy podcast. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. My name is Norris, and I'm a senior investigations reporter here at Open Democracy. And I'm thrilled today to be joined by Rahila Gupta, the writer and journalist, and the chair of Southern Black Sisters. Rahila has worked with the author Beatrix Campbell to write a fascinating, disturbing, inspiring, and sometimes distressing book, Planet Patriarchy. The book explores the many ways in which patriarchy continues to dominate the lives of women and oppress women around the world, and how patriarchy just does not seem to die. In fact, in some cases, it is getting stronger and more aggressive and more violent and causing more harm. The book takes us around the world, to El Salvador and ISIS-occupied Raqqa in Syria, to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, to Russia, to China, to Iceland and its feminist utopia, which may not be quite so utopian as we sometimes believe. And finally to Rojava, where the women's revolution shows what can happen when a political system and a revolutionary movement puts women at its heart and prioritises women's involvement, voice, democratic inclusion and safety. The book looks at the many ways in which patriarchy uses violence against women in order to maintain its hold over power and to oppress women, and how that violence happens in every corner of society, not just in the countries where we see extremist movements or extreme levels of misogynistic violence, but also in our own communities and in places like Iceland, which rank high on the Gender Equality Index. The book looks at the ways in which family and religion has become a tool of patriarchy to oppress women, and explores alternative ways of thinking about family and the historical ways or historical movements of abolishing the family and their relative successes and failures. So thank you, Rahila, for joining us, and welcome to In Solidarity. Could you tell us a little bit about your conversations with Bea and why you decided to write this book now?
I suppose the immediate trigger for this book came as a result of a talk that Beatrix Campbell was giving on the 40th anniversary of the Women's Liberation Movement, which is 2009. And she raised really fascinating questions about the relationship between neoliberalism and neo-patriarchy. And it set me thinking, and I came home and I emailed her and said, I think we need to pin it down further. We need to understand the connection, the importance of patriarchy to various political systems like democracies, like communism, socialism, theocracies, authoritarian states, and so on. And how about it? And to my delight, she agreed. So 15 years later, here we are.
Thank you. And it's so interesting because, I was very early in my feminist activism in 2009, but that kind of feels like a positive time now compared to this backlash that we're living through, whether that's the sort of growing online hate that is directed against women, the rise of the strongman patriarch in global politics, whether that's Trump or Putin, who you look at in the book, or just a continuing epidemic of men's violence against women and girls around the world. And in your book, you, as I say, you take this global perspective and you visit lots of different countries, including El Salvador, including Russia, and including the Rojava women's revolution in the Kurdish areas of the Middle East. But rather than go country by country, I thought it'd be interesting to look at theme by theme and the different ways in which patriarchy, increases and holds on to its power, starting with violence against women and girls. And, you talk about the horrific violence against women in El Salvador and in Raqqa and in Riyadh and under the ISIS regimes. Could you talk a little bit about the power of patriarchy when it comes to violence and how patriarchy is enforced by this violence against women that men commit?
Yeah, I would argue that, violence is the absolute unyielding nub of it. I mean, it took us years to even name what it was and what constitutes it. I mean, if you take the situation in Britain, for example, rape in marriage was not recognized until the 90s. Coercive control only came into law in the last 10 years or so. So it's been a kind of really difficult fight, and I would rather talk about violence in a country like Iceland, because it's kind of to be expected in places like Raqqa under ISIS, where it's an extreme, the starkest form of patriarchy that you can imagine. And so it's one end of the spectrum. And you would expect that in some place like Iceland, which was one of the countries that Bee visited and wrote about, given its position at the very top of the global gender gap, which is in that report, it's always comes at the top in terms of gender equality. So we were really surprised to find the levels of violence that are recorded in Iceland. 40% of women record having experienced some form of physical violence. 1 in 4 women talk about sexual assault and rape. Now, it could be because, if the moment you begin to look into more detail into these figures, the survey that was done took in 1/3 of Iceland's population. Now, it's a very small population; it's only 350,000 people. But 1/3 of that is a really large number of women. And maybe because the figures that we have in most other countries are based on what women report, and those have always been known to be on the low side, we might actually be surprised to find that if we were to do a similar survey in Britain, for example, it would be even higher than what we think it is at the moment. But so making a direct comparison between Iceland and Britain and other parts of the world, it may not be the right thing to do, but it gives us some indication. So you think, what is it about violence that is so central, that even in a country like Iceland, we see this. And so this paradise, of gender equality actually poses a paradox. So I think until we sort out the issue of violence, we are not going to get rid of patriarchy. And again, just looking at the statistics, the femicide rate in Iceland is actually the same as in Britain. But because it's only 350,000 people, there are many years in which there are no deaths of women. So I think it must have an impact on their social imaginary, how they see themselves as a society. And that question really hasn't been studied. We can see that we have had some successes, the fact that we name it, the fact that we have legislation. Almost every country in our study has legislated against domestic violence, for example. In Russia, of course, the direction is in the opposite. Having acknowledged that domestic violence is a crime, they recently downgraded it so that if it doesn't lead to hospitalization and incidents don't happen more than once a year, then the man gets off, with a sort of slap on his knuckles. And then the other issue is that there are hierarchies of violence. So, for example, there's been an attempt by feminists to equate domestic violence with more serious forms of violence like terrorism, because we want to get the issue taken more seriously. And statistics show that more women are killed in such situations than are killed in terrorist incidents. So there are hierarchies of meanings attached to violence, and violence in the domestic sphere is somehow acceptable, it's normalized as compared to violence in the public arena. And you see that with, many countries will have a ministry to deal with law and order, with national security issues, but many countries will not have ministries to deal with women's rights.
We know that one of the sites of oppression that women continue to face is within the family. and particularly the ways in which the far right and other extremist forces frame family and women's position in it. But we do have some examples from history that you look at in the book of ways in which political movements have tried to abolish or reconfigure the family, most notably in Russia after the 1917 revolution. Can you speak a bit more to that?
The Soviet Union really did have a very good idea about the importance of abolishing the family, not because it had any patriarchal understanding of the family, that it was a site of oppression, but it recognized that whilst women were burdened with domestic work, they could not get involved in the revolution. And so that was the slogan, abolish the family, was the slogan that drove the collectivization of domestic chores, such as cooking and childcare. They established canteens, laundries, and creches. But of course, it was in the middle of a war itself, externally and internally, and it couldn't devote the resources that were needed. And so that wasn't really very successful attempt, but they got to the core of the issue. So this is another area that really requires reform. And, at the moment, feminist focus is on getting men to share the domestic labor of social reproduction and so on, with, I have to say, not as much success as one would have hoped.
But there is one revolution that is happening in the world right now, a women's-led revolution in Rojava. And I was wondering if you could tell us about your experiences with the women's revolution and what that tells us about resistance against patriarchy.
Yes. So this is one of my favorite subjects. It was one of my biggest discoveries when I started the research on this book. And it surprises me and pains me that the extent to which this experiment is not known about in the West, although it's been going on since 2012. And it is one of the successes of the Arab Spring, which we in the West are prone to think of as a total failure. And I went to visit it in 2016. I'd heard about it in 2015 when there was a young man who was a Kurdish man who was talking about this, and he was painting a picture of a society in the Middle East where women were in the driving seat, where society was totally secular, where Sharia laws and Sharia courts had been abolished. And I found it really hard to believe, but I thought, if I'm doing a book on patriarchy, then it really is an important place to visit. So I went in 2016, and I was really surprised to find the extent of, I suppose, grassroots democracy, true democracy, which had a formal term according to the theoretical propositions put forward by the leader of the Kurdish struggle for self-determination, a man called Abdullah Öcalan, who has been in prison in Turkey since 1999. And he put forward the idea, having moved from a classic Marxist-Leninist position where he was leading a struggle for this setting up of a Kurdish nation state. He came to the view, well, actually nation states are patriarchal, they are racist because they're ethnically exclusive and anti-democratic. And so he proposed a society in which women were actually in the vanguard, because he developed this view, interestingly, after reading feminist texts in prison. So I really liked that interchange, that cross-fertilization of ideas between the West and other parts of the world. And he came to the view that actually women need to be in the forefront of this revolution. And that is exactly what is happening in Rojava. Every institution is co-led by a man and a woman. the idea of democracy from bottom up is that every neighborhood elects its own representatives, and they have to be a man and a woman, and they have different committees that deal with things like domestic violence or education or the economy or whatever it is, or health, whatever the local community decides is important. And each of these committees have to have 50% representation of men and women. And then they elect representatives to go up to the next level and then the next level and so on and so forth till they're at the very top. And that is a form of their parliament, if you like. And then parallel to this mixed sex structure is a women-only structure, which has exactly the same, from the neighborhood level up to the municipality level, up to city level structure. But they have the right of veto of any legislation that has been passed by the other structure, what's known as the TEVDEM, if it's considered to be against the interests of women, they will veto it. So it really tilts the playing field in favor of women on the basis that that is what will actually lead to a level playing field. So that is absolutely amazing. I would say it's the best place in the Middle East to be a woman. But of course, because the starting point is much lower, in the sense that it comes from a place where, traditions favored polygamy, favored child marriage, there's honor killings and crimes. So they have a bigger hill to climb, but they're doing an amazing job.
It really is an inspiring story and such a testament as to what is possible when women's freedom and women's liberation is put at the heart of a revolutionary and democratic project. Now, I'm aware that for many of our listeners, the word Rojava will be new to you. It is the Kurdish democracy in the Kurdish region of Syria, and it was one of the two Kurdish front lines in the war with ISIS. It's rooted in the battle for Kurdish self-determination, but it also is a battle for left-wing values, for democracy, for women's liberation. And the women in Rojava took up arms in the Syrian civil war in order to fight back against the forces of ISIS and in order to fight for a world where women are equal, where women are respected, and where women can live in a democracy as outlined by Rahila. There's a famous quote where it says, not only are the Kurds battling the Islamists in Rojava, but they are also attempting to create a model of democracy that might actually bring stability to a war-torn region. Now, one of the sentences that really struck me when thinking about the women's militias and the women's revolutionary movement in Rojava is this idea that non-violence is a privilege. And it's a privilege that many Western feminists enjoy. We don't have to think about picking up the gun. We don't have to think about defending democracy in a militarized and militant way. But that wasn't the case in Rojava, and it's not the case for women all over the world. So, Rahila, would you be able to speak a bit more to that?
Yeah, I mean, there is a whole understandably pacifist tradition amongst feminists in the West, where they will, because violence is a resource of masculinity, for women to pick up the gun as a form of self-defense is not considered to be an acceptable form of resistance. And what they have noticed is that having picked up the gun, attitudes of men within their own society have changed towards them. There is a newfound respect for women. And of course, this is not the way that one would want to proceed. But if there is no other choice, and this is why Kurdish women talk about the privilege of nonviolence, they did not have that privilege. And the way in which they define self-defense is a very broad understanding of it. It's self-defense in terms of pushing back against patriarchal intrusions into the way in which we build feminist knowledge, in the way we build women's culture, in the way in which we build an economy. It's got to be an economy where women are in control. They feel so strongly about the fact that self-defense for women would not be possible unless they have some handle on the levers, the economic levers of that society. And so it's a much broader definition. And for me personally, I'm not a pacifist in the traditional sense because, for example, through Southall Black Sisters, we were instrumental in the fight to release Kiranjit Ahluwalia. Now, her form of escaping domestic violence was to kill her partner. Whilst we don't condone that, we also put it in the context of, an ultimate exit, an ultimate response to violence. So I think we have to look at it. Every situation, in my view, should be examined and analyzed in the context of the balance of power. Men are aggressive and use violence as a form of perpetuating their power. Women use violence in order to escape it. And I think that really needs to be held on to. It's a very different response to violence.
I think that's so interesting. And one of the investigations that I worked on for openDemocracy was looking at the ways in which women in the UK are sent to prison despite being victims of domestic abuse, because they are reacting to that domestic abuse. And it's something that as a society, we really struggle to understand how people respond to that victimization and violence. But the women of Rojava are so inspiring, and it really does show that patriarchy does not have to win. There are different ways of organizing economics, of organizing politics, and of organizing society so that women can have a seat at the table and be the decision makers and have a rich life.
I think that its future is so fragile because none of the countries that are interested in the future of Syria are interested because they want to support and promote and maintain and sustain the society. They're interested in Rojava because it is sitting on possibly 80% of Syria's oil reserves. So that is the struggle, that is the challenge that Rojava faces in the world today.
Absolutely. We have one last question, and it's one we ask all of our guests. As you know, this podcast is called In Solidarity, but what does the word solidarity mean to you?
Well, let me, since we've just been talking about Rojava, let me tell you what solidarity means for them, because that was a question I kept asking them. I kept saying, what can we do what can I do when I get back to Britain? And apart from raising awareness of the issue, which I have done as much as I can, and also trying to raise donations where possible, the thing that they wanted most was for us everywhere in the world to set up systems, parallel systems, women's assemblies, to exercise our democratic muscle wherever we are, because in numbers we will be strong. If we are all attempting to in any shape or form, because even before they were given their ability to operate with a greater autonomy, before that they were operating under the radar, under Assad, under Erdogan in Turkey, and so on. They were building these assemblies. They were looking at how to put equality into practice. So that is how they see solidarity. And of course, I think the big thing in terms of solidarity for me is that we need to understand the context in which different struggles take place. I think we are too quick and too ready to be judgmental about different solutions that feminist struggles around the world may have taken to the situation that they're facing. It might be in relation to the degree to which you involve men in your struggle. For example, I'm just giving you one example that comes to mind. We need to be able to understand the decisions that are made in the context that they are struggling in. And that, I think, is an important aspect of solidarity that we tend to forget about.
In Solidarity is produced by James Battershill, Carla Abreu, and Ayodeji Rotinwa. The theme song is Odyssey by Edward Abela. And if you loved what you heard today and you'd like to help support us in making these episodes, you can do so at opendemocracy.net/donate. Thank you so much for listening and have a great day.